If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. The house that history built, Raynham Hall, was built to last. Sir Roger Townshend commissioned it in the early 1620s, and Inigo Jones gave it the kind of symmetry that says power without raising its voice. The hall sits heavy against the Norfolk flatlands, brick, proportion, silence. It was never just a home. It was a declaration. The Townshends were climbing, and the hall climbed with them. By the early 18th century, the family had tied itself to the highest offices in England. Charles Townshend, the second Viscount, moved in circles where politics and marriage were the same transaction. It was in those circles that Dorothy Walpole entered the picture, sister to Robert Walpole, the man who would become Britain's first Prime Minister. Dorothy and Charles had known each other young. There were feelings, and then there was a separation whose exact cause historians still argue over. When they eventually married in 1713, years had passed, and something had changed. What happened to Dorothy inside that marriage, inside those corridors, in the brown room at the top of the staircase, was never fully recorded. What was recorded, cautiously and in fragments, suggested she rarely left the hall in her final years. She died in 1726. The official cause was smallpox, but a quieter version of events passed between households in Norfolk said something else entirely. No one ever proved it. No one ever quite dropped it either. The first whispers from the dark. The first reports came not from servants whispering below stairs, but from guests who held titles, commanded armies, and sat in Parliament. Sometime in the early 1800s, visitors to Raynham Hall began describing the same thing: a woman in a brown dress moving through the corridors at night, solid-looking enough that more than one person initially stepped aside to let her pass. King George IV, then still Prince Regent, reportedly woke in his guest room to find a woman standing beside his bed. He left Raynham Hall before dawn, and according to those close to him, refused to return. No formal account was ever written down in his own hand. What exactly he saw, and why it shook a man accustomed to power and ceremony, was never stated plainly. What did get recorded across separate accounts that had no apparent contact with each other was a consistency in the details that is difficult to set aside. The brown brocade dress, the faint illumination around the face, and then, in some tellings, something wrong about the eyes. Not closed, not open, but gone entirely, the sockets hollow and dark. Two witnesses might agree on the dress and the posture and the corridor where she appeared, then diverge completely on that single detail. Some saw a face, others saw the absence of one. Both cannot be true, and yet both accounts survive, sitting side by side in the record, neither canceling the other out. The night a captain drew his pistol. It was Christmas, 1835. Raynham Hall was warm with company, fires burning, voices carrying down long corridors, the kind of noise that makes a large house feel smaller. Colonel Loftus was among the guests. So was Captain Frederick Marryat, a man who had faced cannon fire at sea and written novels about it afterward. Neither man was easily rattled. That matters. Loftus saw her first, a woman on the staircase moving with a lamp. He said nothing that night, not to Marryat, not to the other guests. The following night he saw her again, close enough to describe. Brown dress, lamp held at chest height. Her face was lit by it. But where her eyes should have been, there was nothing, just dark, sunken hollows. Marryat heard the account and did what soldiers do. He loaded his pistol. When the figure appeared in an upstairs corridor days later, and by his own telling, turned toward him and grinned, he fired at point-blank range. The ball passed clean through her and buried itself in the wooden door behind. The figure did not fall. She simply was no longer there. It was around this time that people began putting a name to her. Dorothy Walpole, sister of Britain's first Prime Minister, had lived at Raynham Hall in the early 18th century. She had been involved with Charles Townshend before his first marriage. When he eventually married her in 1713, some accounts suggest it was less reunion than captivity, that he had discovered an earlier affair and confined her to the hall as punishment. She died in 1726. Smallpox, said the official record. But that explanation, even then, did not fully settle things. The photograph that stopped the world. It was an ordinary assignment. September 1936. Raynham Hall, Norfolk. 2 photographers sent by Country Life to shoot the architecture. Captain Hubert Provand handled the camera. His assistant, Indra Shira, managed the lighting. They had already worked through most of the house when they positioned their equipment at the base of the oak staircase. Then, Shira stopped. He later said he saw something on the stairs, a pale, veiled shape, soft at the edges, moving downward. He shouted. Provand fired the shutter. The plate was developed the same day, with a chemist present throughout. No one touched it unsupervised. What emerged was a figure, translucent, draped, positioned mid-staircase as if caught mid-step. Country Life published the image in December 1936. The response was immediate and global. Photographic experts spent decades pulling the image apart. Some argued double exposure, a face or figure photographed separately, burned onto the same plate. Others pointed to lens flare, condensation, a smear on the glass. But the geometry resisted these explanations. The figure's shape, its position relative to the staircase railings, its apparent depth. Analysts on both sides could not agree on how any known darkroom accident would produce exactly that result. What remains is this. Neither Provand nor Shira ever sold the story further, never lectured for money, never built careers from it. Both died insisting the photograph was real. If it was staged, no one has ever named the mechanism. The debunkers, the defenders, and the disappeared. Every investigator who came to Raynham Hall left with something they could not fully account for. The photographic analysts who examined the 1936 image in the decades that followed largely agreed on what it was not. Not a double exposure, not a deliberate superimposition, not a smear on the lens. What they could not agree on was what it actually was. That gap, narrow as it sounds, proved impossible to close. The post-war years brought a particular kind of scrutiny. Scientific skepticism had become culturally respectable, and dismissing paranormal claims required no evidence of its own, only confidence. Investigators whose conclusions leaned toward the unexplained found their credibility quietly questioned. Those who cried hoax were amplified. The asymmetry was not subtle, but the sightings continued. Staff reported figures in corridors. A family member described a presence on the main staircase in a private letter that only surfaced decades later. None of these accounts were offered publicly. They came out slowly, in memoir fragments and personal correspondence, as if the people involved had been waiting for permission to speak. The Townshend family gave no such permission. They have never commented at length on the Hall's reputation, and portions of their private archive remain closed. Whether those records contain anything relevant is unknown. The family has not said so. They have also not said otherwise. What the Hall will not give up. Raynham Hall is real. Dorothy Walpole was real. She lived, she married Charles Townshend, and she died at Raynham in 1826. Those facts are in the records. The Hall's architecture is documented. The 1936 photograph exists. Its chain of custody is traceable, and the photographers who took it signed their names to what they saw. Captain Marryat was a real man who fired a real pistol. These things are not in dispute, but almost everything around them is. Dorothy's imprisonment, if it happened, exists only in family memory, not in paper. The cause of her death shifts depending on who is telling it. The photograph has been called genuine and called a trick of light, and neither side has ever fully closed the argument. What cannot be explained is simpler and stranger than any of that. Witnesses who never met each other across more than 100 years describe the same figure, in the same place, with the same face, or rather the same absence where a face should be. Marryat fired at something. He said so. He had no reason to lie, and every reason not to. Raynham Hall still stands in Norfolk. The Townsends still own it. The staircase is still there, and the question that sits at the center of all of this, what exactly has been seen on that staircase, and why, has not been answered. Not once.